Hey everyone, welcome to today's episode on our podcast Decisions Now. I am your co-host Erin Pearson along with Chevala. Today we are super pumped to have Chris Ehrlich, who is the managing editor at Datamation, with us today. Chris, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Erin. Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here. And as I mentioned, I really am a fan of the pod. So I think you all have been doing great work on it. So it's really an honor to be here, really.
Thanks, Chris, for joining us.
Thank you. Yeah, it means a lot. Thank you. One of the things, Chris, when we were doing the prep session, there were just so many topics that we had. It was such a fun conversation. So I'm really looking forward to what we're going to be talking about today. But just to get the ball rolling, one of the things that I think really sets a lot of the themes in place for today is mentioning AI as a misnomer in society. So I guess what are your thoughts on what that actually means?
Yeah, I really believe that. I think that it is a true misnomer in that we haven't reached mainstream human-like intelligence. And if that's really the goal or the notion of the term, then I think generally speaking, in terms of mass market applications, we're, as we know, far from that. And so I think it's overused. I think it's oftentimes what we're seeing is when anytime a company is talking about AI, they're really almost exclusively focused on machine learning. And so I think machine learning by comparison is a really apt description and accurate in that sense, and really toward the end of automation. So to me, it's more straight ML and automation, and AI is more of this sort of longer term goal. And I think it's sort of overhyped essentially right now.
No, I agree, Chris. In fact, in the first podcast that we did, we talked about the general AI and narrow AI, right? I mean, why even classify it? Like, to your point, the narrow AI is mostly machine learning, right? The general AI is what people perceive as human-like intelligence. I was just telling Jeff before we joined that I saw this picture of a woman that was completely generated by AI. That woman doesn't exist, right? And it was so detailed. You could see the freckles, the two-tone color of her hair, and so on. But it's not real, right? And that's the perception of general AI. People have that kind of expectation, but then that's not what we apply that in businesses typically. So I agree. Yeah, it's a different perception for sure.
Yeah, so exactly. So Aaron, in
Um,
terms of that, and Ridley, in terms of that point, I love it because I think that the current applications for AI, or the best applications, are really, if you look at it at a consumer level, and as you said, kind of what we can see in the marketplace, is if you look at like Siri and Alexa, to me, those are still sort of on a basic level tied to sort of glorified code essentially, and really this sort of, if we want to call it machine learning. So sort of if this, then that, and it's really tied to just pure kind of basic database technology and search. And that technology has been around for decades, and we've been working on semantics and search for, again, decades, to where if that's sort of a high level application of AI and this sort of notion of human-like intelligence, then I think it's in some ways, I wouldn't say rudimentary, but I still think it's basic and tied to fundamental code to me. So I think there's a lot of opportunity and a lot of upside, but I think we're still in this very much transition period.
no, I completely agree with that. It's like there's this like massive scale of how people talk about AI, and on this scale you have what people say in pop culture, and they use it very generally, and it's this like really amazing like human like intelligence. It's like going to replace humans. It's very sci-fi, kind of scary depending on how you want to look at it. But then you have this reality of what AI actually does. But I think within that, people also use the term like, oh, we have like AI based technology, or, they use it so generally these days that in reality, if you're actually coding stuff, AI is not something that you even should be using. Like unless it's like truly an application of AI. But if it can be solved with like an if then statement, you should be using that instead. So that like that's definitely something that you should gravitate towards because it's simpler and it's going to cause less errors in the short term, and then work on things that push the button somewhere else. But Rigby, since you're in the products in particular, I'm kind of interested your take
No,
on
yeah.
that in
I mean,
particular too.
there's this trend of overusing the term AI in general, and to your point about when a product says it's powered by AI. In fact, when I get into calls with our partners, some of the product vendors and so on, when they say that, I'm like, show me specifically what AI features you have, right? And I go down to the specific, like, go to the screen, click on that button, show me where the AI is, and and then you can gauge the complexity or the sophistication of that product. But there's definitely we're going through that peak, like the crypto world, where we went through a couple of peaks and then now we're plateaued. I think we're getting to that, right? Everyone's used AI so much that we're kind of on the other side now. But really, it is glorified code, even if it's an if then else kind of construct, Chris, like you said. It's just a billion pathways that you just can't write in a humanly way. But at the end of the day, that's what it's doing. It's making a decision down that pathway, right?
And Chris, one of the things that you do, you certainly look at a lot of companies that are using this. Like you talk about it quite a bit. So you've spoken about some of the dangers of using AI as well, or how can you differentiate between like what is fluff and what is not? Certainly, I would not want to be a sales rep on the call with Rigby and have him ask me where specifically is AI used in this button. So I will not be doing that for you, Rigby. But Chris, from your perspective, how can you tell in society like when is AI like legitimately AI versus when is it just a marketing term?
Well, I think it's typically tied to specialization, and my feeling and what I'm seeing is typically startups are the most specialized and they're very application use case specific and technology specific. So I think ultimately the leaders in the market are going to be those that specialize in the subsets of AI, so that specialize in deep learning or machine learning, and then or do the R&D to really get to true AI in some sort of commercial, real applicable scenario, whether it be on the back end or on the front end at a consumer level or user level. But it to me right now is almost exclusively tied to machine learning, to where they're dealing with a lot of data. So in terms of the marketplace, machine learning is what's being used to deal with the abundance of data or the overabundance of data, and that's almost exclusively where we're seeing AI being used in a material sense, to where you're actually handling and dealing with big data, you're processing it, you're analyzing it at a scale that humans cannot and at a pace humans cannot, and you're able to do something specific with it and turn around and use it or do something else with it and move it down the line. So if that's analytics or if that's a business case or if that's customer service or sales or CRM, but that to me is ultimately really where we're at right now. And there haven't been a lot of instances that certainly jump out in this recent past that say, okay, no, this is something very different.
Now, one of the things, just for the audience here, the term AI ML gets used quite a bit. Could one of the two of you define what is the difference between AI and ML, and how do they connect and where are they different?
Yeah, I think it's
I'll let
yeah.
Rigby take a
I'll give
stab
it
on
a
it.
shot, right? So ML, yeah, you're right. AI and ML kind of go hand in hand in most material that you see out there. Um, the way I see it is machine learning is more of a mechanism. It's the means, right, where you apply math to a certain set of problems. So it's in a way it's an applied math problem, and AI is the concept. So it's to me it's like two different things. Like AI is just describing the fact that the outcome of using that mechanism then mimics some sort of a human intelligence, which is why it's artificial intelligence. So that's the way I differentiate in my mind. So when people say AI ML, I'm still thinking, okay, they have some sort of a deep neural network or a simple statistical algorithm in the back. and the application of that and the outcome of that is what's kind of the perception of AI.
Yeah, and I would just add, I love it. I would just add that, yeah, that machine learning, to me, because of the human interaction and the modeling that has to occur and all the training that's happening, that is, as I said, goes back into kind of what we consider basic traditional, what coders, what programmers, what developers are doing, and what those teams are doing at a high level, and they're trying to deal with a lot of data. And then AI is that next level, the graduation of that, to where, yeah, you can apply it in some form to where you are in fact mimicking human intelligence, or it's human-like
Right.
intelligence. And those use cases are so limited. And so if you look at chatbots as another kind of popular example and sort of high level example, yeah, there's some of that happening, and that's sort of the beginning stages of that, and that's nice to see. And it's fundamentally tied to this ingestion of massive data and this sort of output of, okay, well, you asked me this, so therefore it's that. So I don't think it's that dynamic per se yet, but that's sort of a beginning step where you kind of can step beyond machine learning and say, okay, now there's this outcome that has a material application that may, in fact, to the user in a customer service context, mimic a human experience.
I think that's great, and it's good to just get the context behind. When we're throwing around these terms, especially with how we set up the podcast in the beginning, what do we actually truly mean by them? So everyone's on the same page here. Um, One of the things that we also talked about is there's some dangers in using AI, and I think there's two directions that we could take with this. There's a danger in potentially using it as a term that means something. Um, you know, as we've talked about a few times, like we're using it a bit more generally than it's
Mhm.
literally defined, like then it literally is actually getting used. But then there's the the actual when AI truly gets used, what are the dangers in using it? This is a theme that we've touched on in a few past podcasts that we've done as well. That when you're creating algorithms, they're really only as good as the data that you can put into them. So if you are trying to find different themes and trends, I think some of the common ones are if you're looking at hospitals, there's racial data that gets put into it, and then that can impact what's the diagnosis going forward. Similar with HR hiring, if they're trying to figure out what application to choose, all of that historic data does play a role in it going forward. So from your both of your perspectives, what are some of those like key dangers that you think might be emerging even more today?
Well, yeah, I think it's a great point, and I mean, there's two kind of responses. One at a more macro level, but in terms of specifically your comment, yeah, I think bias is real, and if we look at it from just a pure statistical standpoint, and if you look at science historically, bias, you can, manipulate data toward any end, and you can present data to serve whatever purposes you need. And so, yeah, whoever is working on AI or training the ML models, there's going to be that implicit human bias unless there are checks and balances in place at the hiring level, at the staffing level, and then within the technology or within the frameworks that they're working with to say, okay, well, there's some kind of accounting for what you described, where you have variance or you have qualifiers or you have factors that are part of the process to where you can mitigate for that. But I think it's going to always be imperfect because science is imperfect and data is imperfect, and it's always going to have that kind of manipulative effect.
No, I agree. In fact, there's also this, I would say it's a disturbing trend of creating synthetic data to train AI models. And I'm like, well, who's creating the synthetic data? It's another mathematical model, right? So there's inherent bias right there, and you don't know which one's which, right? So if you think of all the building blocks that are being put out there, open source libraries and so on, if you compare that to what I learned in college, we used to do heap sorts and binary sorts. That was like really algorithmic and the most efficient way to sort things, right? For example, and as time went on, we didn't create a new algorithm to sort. We just used one of the best performing ones, right? In a similar way, the evolution of machine learning has gotten to a point where there's so many open source libraries that people just use willy-nilly without knowing the origins of the efficiencies. And if that model was trained on synthetic data, guess what? You're completely off, right? And so it's hard, especially when we're talking about consumer facing AI, and you're dealing with this data that we were just talking about. The data is unpredictable, like people are unpredictable, right? But if you train the models based on artificially generated data, then you're completely off.
And just a follow-up point, Aaron, I really love what you were talking about here in terms of that response. That it made me think, well, also what's going to happen is that we're going to be taking data sources, we're going to be using recycling the same kind of institutional data sources. So if we're taking data from, let's say, government institutions or public health institutions or massive corporations, we're going to be pulling this big data to train or to do whatever we want to do in terms of AI building, and it's going to come with all of that historical bias or all of that perspective, and you can get into a lot of other angles of it too on a human level. Okay, where are these people coming from? Where is this organization coming from? What's their position? What are their goals? What do they value? Are they kind of are they balanced in terms of how they're kind of serving their constituencies and so on and so forth? And I think the answer is no in many cases, because they're so big and they can't sort of manage everyone and everything perfectly. So that to me is a big, I think, concern, is that you're going to be pulling from historically kind of entrenched data sources and data
Which
pools.
are potentially obsolete for the current scenario, right?
Yeah. I'm gonna flip this question around a little bit. So, Chris, you had mentioned that startups are oftentimes one of those like key areas to look at because they're in a more niche area. And Rigby certainly at Evalueserve, you do a lot with like domain specific AI as well. So, whereas you don't want a bias to be put into your data, you do want it to be specific to the use case that you're trying to solve. So, how do you differentiate between making sure that you have an I guess both a large enough set of data that you can use AI to do something with it, narrow enough that it's specific to a use case, but also so it doesn't develop bias as well. Do you guys have thoughts on how to execute on that properly?
I think offhand, just if I could jump in, I think bias is going to unfortunately be an afterthought. I think at this point with the technology that candidly that if you have that what you just described, if you have a startup that has the funding and the inclination and the team to build something that's very sort of application specific and can serve this niche, then they're going to proceed. And I think that the market will respond, and there's demand for that, especially at the machine learning level. And then bias is going to hopefully be built in at the front end, but if not, that will be sort of a workaround, and or the customer and the marketplace will say, well, okay, wait, how do we make sure that this is good data and so on. But I think right now there's this desire for the technology on a initially.
Right. And I think, Erin, you touched on a very good point about the domain specificity, right? Frankly, if I just fantasized, and let's say I was not at Evalueserve and I was at a different organization, and I was given the mandate to create a domain specific AI engine, I don't even know where I would start, because at least at Evalueserve, we have the benefit of 2 decades of this domain expertise that we built, and kind of without bias, because it was done manually at the beginning, right? So over time, of course, we've automated it, but to me, that's the core proposition of anyone who claims domain specificity, to look at their legacy, right, and see if they truly can pull it off, because the critical mass of data required for that is pretty high. Even today in some domains, when I'm talking to our AI team, they're like, I wish we had a little more of this data, right, before they can come back and say this algorithm is rock solid, right? So to me, it's a function of both the domain expertise that you build over time to avoid those biases, and you have that critical mass of data.
Okay. And so one of the other things that we touched on a bit is where is AI certainly advancing the most? And Chris, I think you had also said earlier today, it's in a lot of the customer facing use cases. So one of the things traditionally, I think, in B2C environments, you see innovation typically happening a little bit faster than in a B2B world. I'm not sure if that's actually the case when you're looking at every AI algorithm that you can add in to something. But I'm just curious first, just from like a fun perspective, what are some of like the coolest innovations that both of you are seeing, whether it's B2B or B2C, of companies using and applying AI?
I'll let you go first, Chris.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I mean, in terms of the fun part, I think if we do look around, I mean, and look at the marketplace, there are kind of robotic kind of automation, retail, very retail consumer facing applications that are beyond the prototype stage and have, are viable right now, and whether they're being embraced and however widely they're being adopted or how sort of necessary they are is another question. But you have like basically servers functioning in restaurants, or bots sort of traveling about in a restaurant, taking orders, returning the tray back, and so on. You can be cleaning the interior of airplanes without basically a staff member. Essentially, they sort of set the machine in motion, and it can clean the cabin. And so these are sort of a marriage of automation and AI and sort of robotics, and that there's some very interesting applications there that I think are, I wouldn't say mature, but they're certainly sort of bona fide. But I don't think the demand is there. And I would just say that in terms of fun and really the applications at the consumer level, in terms of this pod, I was thinking, well, if you look at like a smartwatch, I think is a great example, or the Google Glass, or that there's this innovation, but the demand doesn't seem to be match up with the technology, the innovation, to be clear. And so I think that's part of what's happening now. And so there has to be a better argument, or a better product ultimately that I don't think we have right now.
No, I agree. And since you brought up Google Glass, for example, that came out a few years ago, and I think they've had a couple of attempts at that. Now, the issue with that was not the technology itself. Like, what they did was cool, completely AI driven, but the fit, right? The market fit is where the issue was. And now they're coming back with a translation, a live translation thing, which is completely powered by NLP. And it's so fast that, as you talk, it just translates right into your glass. That is a powerful use case. When you're traveling, you have multilingual groups that you're conversing with. Now that's where they're potentially going to hit product market fit, right? So it's a confluence of both technology innovation and the desire to use that, right? I think that's where most startups fail. Yeah.
Yeah, and I agree. I love the point that I think the specificity, I think, is oftentimes lost on the innovation, considering how much R&D and how much money is behind these initiatives and these products. To me, it's interesting that you can have that kind of disconnect, and I think that especially at the big tech companies, you have to really have that focus. Any company certainly, but you need to look at what's happened before and say, okay, why didn't that work, or why didn't that stick, and be humble enough to say, well, what is our innovation here, and what is the need? And do they know, in fact, that there is this demand? And I think that they're overestimating, I think, oftentimes the market demand, especially at the consumer level. And there needs to be almost an education and awareness. There needs to be these applications that really change people's day-to-day lives. And I think that's why the chatbot
Mhm.
is so prevalent, because the businesses, it serves a very specific business use case, and then it serves a very specific consumer use case that people, whether they're accepting it, but it's there. It's been massively
Now
adopted.
you expect the chatbots to be on every website. I
Yeah,
mean, you're
yeah,
like, then what do I do now if you don't see it?
yeah.
I think that's like super interesting too, because it is about getting the timing right. So it's one thing, does the technology exist or could it exist today? But it's another thing, is the market actually ready for it? And I think this is, whether or not you're talking about AI, I think this is a true
Mhm.
concept really anywhere, is you oftentimes have to lead people into a new idea or concept. And that could take, in the case of something like AI, it could take decades to actually get people kind of mentally ready for some of these pieces. I know some people who had created what was effectively Zoom like back in the 90s, and it just naturally didn't take off. The market wasn't ready for it at that point, but
Yeah.
the technology was there. So there's certainly an element of product market fit, which could also limit how what use cases AI is actually capable of, because the market might reject them as well. So that could have some certainly ebb and flow on how innovation works. Something that I actually personally find very interesting is especially when you're looking at the B2B or B2C use cases, or when you're talking applying it like AI as a chatbot. It's really there to help you, but you don't feel like you're giving like your personal information to it. Whereas when it's literally impacting, like it's watching everything that you're doing, what ads you're reading, how are you interacting with the ads, it's changing pricing based on all of that. That feels a bit more personal. So I think people are more ready for those kind of chatbot style use cases rather than some of these other ones where they're not quite ready to see how the level of AI or personalization that goes into it. So do you guys feel like that is going to impact the rate of innovation?
Yeah, I think it's a great point. I think that what you mentioned in the previous point also, that these iterations, and it's sort of really unpredictable. I think for companies to pretend that they can anticipate or predict what's going to happen in the marketplace or what the demand is. I mean, that the reality is you cannot. So they can certainly do their best, but I think it's ultimately these iterations of technology. And so, as we said, some of them take, some don't for whatever reason, and that yeah, there's going to be this sort of natural evolution and outgrowth of technology to the next, if it's based on AI. And so I think that, like, if we look at like the recommendation engines on the streaming services, those are using a lot of this sort of AI technology, ML technology, and people accept it and love it. And then they often joke, well, oh my gosh, it knows exactly who I am and what I want to
Right.
watch and so on. And that's been around for a long time. And people joke about it because of what you just said, that there is this sense like to say, okay, well, how much is too much? And I think that that's sort of where companies are stopping, because they need to roll out something that can be sort of embraced. And I think that's sort of the fear from at the consumer level, whether that's valid or not, is to say, I don't want this robot, or I don't want this machine, as you just said, to know everything that I'm thinking and what I'm going to do next and think before I do. And that construct, or that notion, is, I think, definitely off-putting. And I think why a lot of companies are staying more in the back end and staying more in the B2B applications.
Yeah, and the fact that you don't want it in some cases is so true. Like I was just talking to my cousin about a show that she watched on Netflix. I'm like, I've never heard of that. And she's like, well, it showed up in my recommendation thing. I'm like, not in mine, you know. Same thing with the news, right? Like my Google News feed is completely different from my friends. So first thing I ask is, did you read this, right? And they're like, nope. And then I'm like, okay, so their feed is different, and therefore, then we can talk about that topic. So it's almost like these recommendation engines, for example, just put you down a rabbit hole that you really don't know, or are not getting other perspectives and other points of view. I don't know if that's good for us. I mean, if I'm against gun violence, for example, I'm probably only going to get articles that are against it, right, and not for it. I just don't get the opposing point of view at that point. So that's, I don't know if it's good or bad. That's, I know Google has a huge team on ethical AI and removing this bias, and they've been partly successful, but it's still an open problem.
Okay, I love the point, and yeah, I think mainly there's been an ongoing backlash now for years against the use of data to essentially, data mining, using data against or
Hmm.
for the consumer, and toward these kind of commercial ends. And while there is this utility, yeah, I think that's a great point. The utility is, what is utility, and what is the human value of that utility? And there's this understanding, I think, now, this sort of fatigue, essentially, to say, I don't want to be sort of sitting, sort of attached to this technology per
Hmm.
se, indefinitely, or the whole night or the whole weekend or whatever the case is. And I want it to have real value for me. And I think that the threshold is higher in recommendation engines, for instance, especially on the web. Some form of them has been happening since the inception, really. And so it's invisible to people, and people, as you say, kind of expect certain technology. But I think that's, again, the argument. Well, we need to sort of evolve and graduate past
Hmm.
that and say, okay, well, what can we do that's truly innovative with all this AI tech that we seem to have? And I think, yeah, I think that's it exactly. That there's this fatigue
Hmm.
and backlash.
Um, I I think that that's a great point. I think there's a lot of other topics that we had also talked through that we haven't been able to hit on in their entirety today. But I'm running low on time, so I do have just one last, and I'm going to try to make it kind of a fun question. So, based on everything that we talked about, what is your favorite kind of recent innovation in AI? You touched on this a little bit earlier, but if you could like name one use case that you think is particularly interesting, what is that AI based use case?
Hmm. I mean, I suppose, I mean, I'd have to go with just I mean, reluctantly, if Siri and Alexa are this sort of this high end, then I'll just say it's not me per se, but I'll say what they can do in theory and what they're capable of at a high level, this sort of assistant, and then can be a human like partner. I think is the beginnings of if it's sort of human interaction, if it's tackling loneliness, if it's tackling therapy, counseling, business kind of dynamics. I think that they are the beginnings of something bigger for sure.
Agree. And my favorite is more on the computer vision. I don't know if you guys use the magic eraser feature in Google Pixel. You take a picture, you can remove people from the background. You just, swipe them off.
So
Every
Rigby's
time,
there removing his
I'm
friends.
taking a picture, I'm like, I don't mind the photo bomber, I can just take them out.
And Erin, if I may, if I have one other quick comment, if I may.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that in terms of a discussion on AI, I think that what we need to, all of us in the industry, the market needs to say, okay, step back and look at now kind of the socioeconomic ripple effects of AI. And I think a lot of people are sort of dismissing it and saying, okay, hey, you're overthink. It's sort of this worry isn't valid, isn't real. And I think a lot of people feel that way, but I think that it goes so far beyond just sort of another tech tool or tech utility to where we're talking about mimicking and recreating human-like intelligence. If that's the goal, then that's sort of not. There's no sort of standard. There's no sort of precedent for that. And I think that there's going to be socioeconomic effects that really displace a lot of people in real ways that we're not accounting for, and that we need as an industry and associations and different groups need to sort of be addressing
Yeah.
that, on the front end.
Yeah, I think the first step is to be aware, right? Like you said, and that there is going to be an impact, and then you can at least go evaluate what the impact is. If you're in denial, then you don't even start.
Yeah, not I don't. Yeah, this denial exactly. The denial, right?
Yeah. And I think that there's a lot of recent events that have come out in the news over the past few days, even that tie into that point pretty nicely. But Chris, I'm kind of out of time here, but I loved the conversation, loved having you on, and I really appreciate everything that you were able to add today.
Absolutely. Thanks, Erin. Thanks, Rigby. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it. Pleasure.
Access the full episode of Decisions Now on our website, and don't forget to subscribe to Decisions Now podcast today.